Hey everyone, just gonna get started here. Get Pierre to join. There we go.
Hey Pierre,
Hey, hey,
how are you?
how's it going?
Good, good. Uncle P.
Uncle P,
Yeah, how are
how are you
things?
today? Things are good, man.
Good, good. Yeah, I've got a bit of a migraine, so I'm not going to be my A game here. So,
Usual chipper self. That's
well,
okay.
we'll try, but we
Yeah,
all have
man.
days like this, so it's all
Yeah,
part of
we
the
sure do.
process. Yeah,
How's your weekend
cool.
been so far?
Just the usual. Trying to take things slow and listen to my body, but that's
Yeah.
about it. Yeah. How
How
about
do you
you?
usually? It's been good. There's some a lot of uh Disney Plus movie watching here,
Yeah,
and one
nice.
movie in particular that's relatively new, Turning Red,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
sort of actually is very fitting with what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it's actually funny. A lot of the Disney movies draw upon the archetypes.
Yeah,
So you're right, it is fitting. I haven't seen it yet, but my son has, so
it's really
I'll
good.
have to. Yeah, I'm
A
just trying
little
to get my.
advanced, and it's really good. Yeah,
Great.
man.
Well, so we are going to talk about the shadow. Sorry, I did cut you off. You were going to ask me a question, so before we get into that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you usually respond to migraines.
Well, I typically power through, but I'm trying to use some wisdom now and slow things down.
Yeah, fair,
Yeah, yeah,
totally
um,
fair.
yeah. But yeah, that. How about yourself?
When I get them, I usually power through, unfortunately, but I also find there's only a limitation to that,
Yeah,
or there's a pretty strong limitation to that. At some
yeah.
point, my body wins out over my brain, except that it's sort of I'm just sort of I become like I'm fighting myself for uh, to recover, and ultimately, I
Hmm.
suppose in either case, the brain ends up winning, uh, or at least the body component of our brain ends up winning.
Yes, for
Yeah,
sure, for sure.
yeah,
That could
man.
be fitting too, for today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, let's jump right into it. So we've been meaning to talk about what does the term shadow mean. It gets thrown around quite a bit without a real explanation of what it is, what it entails, and what can people do about it. So I'm
Yeah,
trying to debunk that and share some knowledge around it, but that's again, sometimes knowledge is fairly limited, and people have other perspectives and theories around it too. So
yeah.
maybe I'll
Well,
throw it over to you. Like,
I
what
was just
does
going to throw it over to you. You did a good reel about it, and I thought
thanks?
it was very fitting. And so maybe just worth
Sure.
revisiting your descriptor.
Yeah, I'll summarize it. I guess
Yeah,
from based on the research I've done and some of the reading I've done, the shadows really parts of ourself that we are typically not aware of. They can be unconscious, or we've tucked them away because of the discomfort they can bring. And quite often they manifest themselves as, in my case at least, I can speak to is anger and resentment because we're repressing this part of ourselves. We're not letting it come to the surface. So yeah, that's how it kind of manifests itself. I did touch on how as adults we typically will project onto others or deny or use defense mechanisms when our shadow is brought to awareness, whether by someone else or it's coming up to the surface on our own. And because we're so uncomfortable with the notion of this self that we've hidden, the reason why we project it is we try to blame others, and um, the things we don't like about ourselves, we'll try to point them out in others. So it's easier for us to get angry with others and have that resentment.
yeah, that's a good. I think that's a good overall summation of what this term is all about. It is a term
Hmm.
that's used quite uh, quite a lot of late. I mean, in general, it's rarely spoken of, but in the realm of self-work and personal development, and certainly in the realm of psychology, it is a term that's been around for some time,
Hmm.
uh, and has been used by a number of different scientists and
Yeah.
psychologists and philosophers around uh, these parts of us that get hidden,
Hmm. Hmm.
that we have less exposure or access to,
Yes.
but not no exposure or access to. It's sort of interesting, the work of the sort of the work of understanding these parts of us. The shadow is the unconscious, really.
Hmm.
Um, Suggests that we can access bits and pieces, or at least appreciate how they show up within our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess for people that are interested to dive deeper, it's basically the concept of the shadow and the archetypes that come out of it was based on the work that Carl Jung had done. So yeah, people want to go look it up further. I think the reason why I'm a little reluctant to provide a definition at times is because often our view is limited, and my definition may be fitting for myself, but it may not apply to everyone. So I always encourage people to go do your own research and kind of look it up and understand, rather than relying on one person's very limited perspective.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, the sort of idea of parts of us that feel like we don't have access to is, I mean, has been touched upon, I think, by many different people. And even if we don't necessarily, like, you can really geek out over the history of this term and Jungian archetypes, um, and not necessarily do a lot of your own personal work. You can also get really tripped up over this term
Hmm.
without necessarily appreciating the fact that it is too just it's sort of a theorized view of the way in which we engage in our world and the parts of
Hmm.
us um, that we hide, or that may
Right.
be even hidden from us, that
Yes.
may develop over. And I saw a question pop up over
Yeah.
whether these are our own things or sort of the 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 forward carryover of our parents, and a lot of the research around parts of us that get hidden either from ourselves or from the world around us really does suggest that much of it is born out of uh, societal norms and prejudices, the
Yep.
ways in which we've been um, raised to either magnify the parts of us that feel um, like they've been reinforced,
Yes.
and to suppress or eventually repress the parts of us that aren't as acceptable.
Hmm. Hmm.
And sometimes that's not necessarily, the parts of us that get sort of hidden aren't necessarily always bad, although I think a lot of the work around shadows suggests that there are the parts of us that feel somehow hidden because they're negative or maladaptive, but in fact, some of them are actually our talents and
Yes.
just bits of us that we might not have gotten a lot of praise for
Hmm.
growing up, or
Absolutely.
perhaps were told to tamp down, encouraged to tamp down, and
Yeah.
eventually became so hidden that we're not even aware to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to kind of go back to that question, I would say I think it's a function of both. There's oftentimes as children, if our parents punished us for something that didn't fit a box. Because I believe we, as children, based on society right now, whether it's school or our own parenting, kids are expected to fit into a certain box. So if that part of you was punished or not reinforced, as you mentioned, Pierre, I think that would be repressed. So that could be a function of our parenting, or how we were parented. But then there's also a function of us as individuals in society, especially as kids. If we were bullied or made fun of for something that was unique about us, we would try to repress that as well to fit in. And then, as I mentioned earlier, as adults, it would manifest itself in different ways. And that's where I believe the anger or the rage comes in, because we feel we can't be ourselves because of how we were treated when we were children.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the stuff that we may have access to and hold back is not necessarily what we're talking about here. So having access to our sadness but holding it back because the time may not feel the most ideal to bring it about is not necessarily the work of our shadow. It's really we're capable of suppressing actively and consciously bits of us that feel like they are not acceptable in the moment, but we may still have access to what those forces and parts of us are.
Yes.
Having a funny thought at a funeral is sort of an example. We're able to hold back from sharing it or showing our happiness for social norms, or in a sad situation, or vice versa. This is really the parts of us that are so hidden that often they're out of, by nature, they're out of the realm of our awareness to them. That they are generally bits of us that we have found so unsavory, or have been reinforced as so unsavory, that that we hide them. We don't tap into them, and so they remain hidden, and at times so hidden that we don't even access those forces themselves.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, so now we've kind of, at a high level explained what the shadow self is, and why it's there, and where it's hidden and stuff. But now for people that are wondering, like, well, I feel comfortable just having this shadow self, and it's painful to work through, or there's a lot of uncertainty involved with dealing with your shadow self because of the answers that might come up. And quite often it's just easier to let it be. We've been able to function for so many years as who we are. Why do anything about it?
It's a great question. In some cases, I'd say most of us don't.
Right.
We don't start to dig into it very much. And that may be okay. The challenge there is like emotions that get so bottled up that we're not even aware to them. They are likely to emerge in our interpersonal interactions. They're likely to emerge in their own way, in their own right. And so these are still parts of us that are very much powerful. Our lack of awareness to them doesn't necessarily diminish their power. If anything, it diminishes our awareness to their capabilities. And so as a result, what ends up often happening is our interpersonal relationships get impacted in ways that we don't see. Or we have trouble finding meaning or value or purpose in what we engage in, because we're not necessarily willing to explore or embrace these parts of us that are very much forces in how we interact in the world, how we engage the world around us and one another. If we're not really willing to engage them, we're sort of we're kind of destined to to just be at their mercy. And so
Yes.
the value of being aware to these parts of you, to this part of you, is sort of unified. We kind of talk about it as though we're one thing, but it's a collection of many different
Correct.
forces. The value of it is really being able to embrace our fullness with a greater degree of awareness, a greater degree of appreciation for the forces that might be guiding us to the lives that we want, or perhaps maybe steering us away from the life that we want.
Yes. Yeah. 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 And just to expand on that, I think what you mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't really go to find that awareness or dig deep. And I don't think there's a set timeline or process around it. I think for most people, it comes to a point where you're realizing that you're repeating the same behaviors or patterns or outcomes or relationships over and over again. And I think a lot of people get stumped recognizing, okay, well, why does this keep happening? And often when you start looking inward and recognizing what the common denominator is and all of that, that's when I believe you're truly ready to dig deep. And even that could take a while, because quite often you don't have the resources or don't know where to start. And sometimes you get the information that you may not be comfortable with and get discouraged. So I guess what I would like to highlight for people is it is a process. Take it slow, and only do it if you're ready. I don't think it's something that you should do because someone else told you to do it, or it feels like it's the thing to do nowadays because everyone talks about shadow work. So yeah, it's being ready, and then having forgiveness for yourself, because whatever it is you repressed, quite often it happens in childhood, and again, you don't have the resources and the tools back then to be able to express yourself or talk through it. If you're in school and everyone's kind of in a certain way and you have to fit in, meanwhile you repress parts of yourself, that's not your fault. However, one thing I'd like to highlight is it is your responsibility as an adult to perhaps do something about it, because it's nobody else's fault either, when you're an adult. So those are a couple of points I would like to expand on and highlight. But yeah, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, I think my first thought around that is the people around you might be really able to access more of who you are. You may be able to prevent falling into traps that are really common to you that maybe you're not even aware of, but if you're not aware of, then perhaps they're going to impact your relationships. That said, I think to piggyback on what you were mentioning around having to be in a place where you're really invested, you're interested in discovering more about yourself, and to be in a place also to respond to that awareness with a sense of both forgiveness, both grace for yourself, and also a sort of sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy, that you're capable of responding to that level of awareness in a way that moves you forward rather than holds you back. It also
Absolutely.
means, I'd say, in the same way that personal development work can, and really engaging in sort of guided self-work,
yes,
can lead you closer to a path of defining your ideal life and the way in which you engage with people and engage with the world in the way that you want, and move you toward it. There are going to be some people who are not accustomed to you doing that, and so it is inevitably, as you start to dig into these these parts of you. And really, as you start to introspect in general, there are going to be some circumstances in which people may be accustomed to your ignorance to these parts. It's a
Yeah.
normal sort of human experience. We're all kind of ignorant to these parts until we begin to dig into them. And in fact, I don't know that anyone's agreed that or suggested even that we'll suddenly at any point have access to all of the elements of our shadow or all of the elements of our unconscious. I think that's not feasible.
Right.
Nor is it always very valuable. But it is a process that changes interpersonal dynamics and intrapersonal dynamics. And so it is to be taken with a degree of, I wouldn't say heaviness, but not with the sort of the suggestion that everyone is in the right place for it, that it's the right thing to do because it's popular. It certainly gained popularity in men's personal development. I think there is something really approachable for men around this concept of the shadow, and maybe even something a bit alluring to it. It feels more approachable than sort of referring to bits of us as unconscious or untapped or parts of us to which we're unaware. It sort of suggests that we've got like this sort of altar to which we can get a little more clarity around who we are and what's important to us.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge Jim's comment earlier about fear. I think that's applicable to, I can only speak for myself, but definitely part of it is fear, because same thing, like I was expected to be a certain way as a child, and then fitting into that box was reinforced. So it was like, okay, well, here's the validation I'm getting. And this kind of takes me to my next point I wanted to make, and perhaps pose a question too, is do we then attract the same type of people in our lives so we can constantly get that reinforcement and validation of how we were expected to be? And I believe that is the case. And the reason why we build up anger and resentment is because we know deep down inside that's not how we want to be treated, but it feels familiar and comfortable, so we continue to chase it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that familiarity drives so much of our behavior, and fear ends up serving for us as this sort of unifying deflecting pole. And so the reality of those fears, though, is quite often that our responses to them, our actual response of fear, is very limbic. It's rooted in pretty primitive networks that aren't necessarily great gauges of the finer details of how strongly something should be feared or how strongly something should be responded to in a particular way. And so that fear ends up keeping us from trying out something different within our lives.
Correct.
If even it's just a little bit, there's a sense that our internal response as fear is not really one of a strong gradient. It's almost like I'm either comfortable or I'm sort of comfortable, or I feel these sort of sensations that are familiar or that are acceptable. And once I feel fear, there's a strong tendency to want to run. And so that may be jumping from a 5-foot ledge as strongly as it is jumping from a 50-foot ledge. Right. And so it's hard to really use the gradient of fear as a guide to make small pivots in our lives. So we stay often on a very comfortable, or at least a non-fearful path.
Right.
And that fear ultimately ends up keeping us from taking even small steps to change patterns that may be not so adaptive or not so valuable to us.
For sure. For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to add, like, the concept of fear in this space is fairly broad, right? It
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
fear
Yeah.
of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of guilt, fear of shame. There's many different layers of fear that drive that repression of whatever parts of yourself that you're hiding. And then to your point earlier, I think there's a negative connotation to it because often it's referred to as the dark side of our personality because it's in the shadow. So, and I think you touched on it too, is there's nothing wrong with it. It's just how we were conditioned earlier in our life to repress those parts. And I guess the other piece before we move on to the next topic, if there's any motivation needed to perhaps even look inward and do this work is to understand how look back and see how many times you've let your emotions enforce your decisions. Like how many of us have been in situations where we let our emotions get the better of us or dictate how we were going to react or behave. And that alone should be enough motivation to understand that, okay, there's something else inside of us that's driving that choice or behavior. And perhaps we need to look inward if you truly want to do something about it.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I think it starts to bring up even these concepts and questions about the the differences between our innate reflexive emotions that may be guided by parts of us that are not brought to our cognitive awareness and the parts of us and our explanations and stories for how we engage in the world and
Mm-hmm.
make decisions and engage in our lives. Often we're driven, I think this is true especially for men, to make decisions based on sort of cognitive logical reasoning. Well, I think in theory that's just fine, except there's so much that's driven around our emotions that guide us
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
guide us without necessarily without having to follow social norms,
Mm-hmm.
without having to follow, even make sense. They don't have to be logical in any way. We think
Right.
about this very commonly in um, the experience of love that doesn't necessarily follow a textbook. Um, it doesn't have to look like we were taught it should look. And yet it's a really powerful force and it's an enriching force within our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And in situations like those, um, our cognitive reasoning is not always going to drive us to making the most valuable decisions. And by valuable, I mean the ones that are not necessarily right or wrong, but the ones that are most strongly suitable toward our values, the ones that move us forward in honor of who we are and that in which we believe. And so that is to say that appreciating the elements and aspects of our lives to which we don't necessarily have logical reasoning, that we don't necessarily think through, um, I think in many ways enriches our understanding of how we engage the world and how we
Yes.
bring our best selves to it.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I guess the next segue would be what does one do to integrate their shadow self? Like, great, we've talked about getting awareness, we've talked about the benefits of it, but how does one do the work? And obviously, we won't be able to cover it all.
Sure.
But I think there's an aspect of overlap with inner child healing too in this aspect, because a lot of it does overlap in the sense that the shadow itself is created often in childhood. It may not be the case all the time, but most of the time that is the case. And then we just continue to repress parts of ourselves as we get into adulthood. So yeah, so I guess kind of moving in that direction around integrating that part of ourselves, like how does one even start? Where do they start, first of all?
Yeah. I think I think it sort of going back to it, I think it starts with a level of curiosity and awareness to how parts of us will show up in ways to which we may not necessarily appreciate in
Mm-hmm.
full, unless we get a little curious about them.
Yes.
And usually they're not necessarily, they may be in our heads in terms of our thinking, but they're often intrinsic responses to certain situations. So they may be a level of awareness to strong reactions to things around us, and questioning, maybe not even questioning, but just sort of getting curious to, like, I
Mm.
wonder what is what's this reaction I'm having to this particular
Mm-hmm.
situation.
Mm-hmm.
It may be, for me, I get a really strong reaction whenever I see um, someone whose voice is held back being taken advantage of, sort of like the
Mm-hmm.
underdog,
Yes.
and um, someone who's marginalized be more so. It just like gets me really emotionally fired up, and I can appreciate the cognitive reasoning behind it, but it's an almost immediate response. It's a limbic kind of
Mm-hmm.
emotionally visceral response. Um, and I think a lot of that has been for me rooted in the way in which I've seen myself, uh, sort of self identity that I've kind of kept under wraps.
Yep.
And I've just sort of gained more awareness to the aspects of me that get really fired up in certain situations, whether it's a joyous sort of a feeling of a fired up, or um, a really angry one. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a
Mm-hmm.
start.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And just to
yeah,
add, I think it may manifest itself either as aggression, which I don't mean to make it sound like violence or any
no,
of that,
no,
but aggression. Yeah, just for the viewers, like there's the aggression, and then quite often people also respond passive aggressively, where they'll say something, you could tell it's coming from a place of anger, but they're
yeah,
not being direct about it. And whereas aggression is, people will either act out angrily, or there might be a little bit of rage. And in either case, I would like to say that people are trying to control their environment because they feel so out of control within
yeah.
themselves. And that's where that projection comes out. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
No,
I
I think
wanted to.
that's great. I think there's an additional degree of value to recognizing how shadows will typically show up. And so, uh, in men, there are a number of archetypes that are commonly referred to. And I think one resource that combines some of Jung's work around archetypes and shadows and some more modern thinking around masculinity is
Yes,
king, warrior, magician, lover, or lover,
yes,
magician.
yeah,
That kind of gives some exposure to common archetypes of masculinity, but also to active and more passive or passive aggressive poles. And I think when we see and read about these
mm-hmm,
elements, it's common that we sort of see bits and pieces of ourselves in those stories. So I would say, in addition to being aware of how what sort of emotions might come up for me internally, there is also some value in just being aware of how shadows typically emerge, what archetypes are commonly expressed for, in this case, in men's work, for
mm-hmm,
men, and how active and more passive elements of the shadow may emerge with specific archetypes. And I think that's often where we see, well, ooh, maybe this is more common to men around us as well. It feels a little more acceptable, approachable to say, well, hey, I may have this sort of this part of me, I do have this part of me that may create a vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And how might I gain some awareness to it? Not necessarily to control it. Often trying to control it ends up fueling
Yes.
it in some ways, but in many ways. But really, how
Mm-hmm.
do I just gain some appreciation to it? How
Right.
do I know when
Right.
it's emerging? How do I respond to it?
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Yeah,
beginning of it. Yeah.
for sure, for sure. And you're just wanting to expand on the control part of it. You're right. Like it only makes it worse because we can't control our environment realistically. And the more we try,
Yeah.
the more frustrated we get. And that almost reinforces that belief we have about ourselves, that limiting belief in a way, which is like, oh, here we go again. Like this is why I've repressed this part of myself because
Totally.
people, so that's the downside of trying to control the environment. And then when we started this, we talked about Disney movies, and when you start understanding, like the common theme is quite often the main character has some shadow self to integrate,
Yeah.
right? And often it starts off, things are great, and then they almost deal with this great deal of adversity, and they often need to go away and look within themselves to integrate that shadow, and then they come back in a much better place with more humility and curiosity. So that's why I like the Disney
Yeah.
movies, and they're successful for a reason because we're trying to teach our youth that as well.
Yeah. I'll put a plug in for Turning Red. I think it does this really nicely, but it really is like probably the most in your face kind of I mean, it's a remarkable degree of this part of you or this part of me that I have to somehow contain, but ends up actually being a part of me that is lovable.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I won't give away the movie, but the gist is rather than try to squash something, you can learn to make room for it.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that feels
Yeah.
much more easy. And I don't mean easy in the like really, seamless to accomplish. I mean, it sort of allows for this peace or this ease um, in the way in which we see ourselves and the way in which we interact with the world that I think
Mm-hmm.
most of us are seeking. I think more than anything, um, most of us who are invested in personal betterment or personal development are really looking to have more spaciousness, to have more peace, to have more ease within our lives. It's not necessarily to make our lives, um, you know, uh, so
Difficult.
simple that they become not challenging, but it is to say that we're not creating these extra elements of conflict or resistance that get in the way of our being able to appreciate what we've got right in front of us, or to
Mm-hmm.
change our
Mm-hmm.
situations if we need to change them.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. And I think part of it is being able to explore those parts, right? So we've touched on integrating it, but how do if you're a creative person by nature and that was repressed in you as a child or even as an adult, how can you integrate that? And I think one of the things I've had to do personally, because that's kind of my story, is start exploring that creative side of myself. It doesn't mean I just do a full 180, quit my career and just go off doing something completely different. It's being able to explore it and see how it feels. And maybe you're
mm,
more in alignment with yourself and you feel a lot better because now you're letting that part of yourself come out and be integrated with who you are in a very, I guess the word I'm trying to look for is in a very slow fashion, right? You're not rushing it,
so
because that can
important.
also feel, yeah, that could also feel overwhelming. So
Yeah,
yeah, so that's kind of the other piece I would add is, if you are looking to explore, try to embed it into your life slowly, and see how that feels. Like, I think part of it is, a lot of the times we have this dysfunctional way of looking at life or thinking, because we're not allowing that part to come out, and we're not letting it, we're not exploring it. So see if that allows you to get more alignment. That's the one thing I would encourage.
Yeah, I'd piggyback on that by just sort of maybe normalizing the experience of all or nothing thinking. It can get in the way of exploring bits of us that feel like they've been hidden, and introducing them. And slow is definitely the name of the game here. I mean, I think slow in general is the name of the game.
Yeah.
Much as I think a 30, 60, 90-day transformation, that's the transformations feel really appealing and sexy in a lot of ways. They often will reinforce this idea that things are either completely one way or completely another. And in terms of shadow work, just like many things in our lives, it's really what's in the grayscale that feels most realistic, most sustainable, most valuable to each of us. And I think for that reason, it becomes important that we start by introducing elements of our that have been held back, elements of our shadow that are acceptable, that don't rock the boat so much that everyone's got to kind of jump ship, but allows for a little bit of forward movement. And so I think it's those slow, steady gains that allow for us to feel more and more comfortable integrating elements of who we are that we begin to recognize and appreciate and want to integrate into our lives, and build the forward momentum to actually make sustainable, long-lasting changes. So we're not sort of going back and forth in this sort of pendular or pendulous kind of a way. That we kind of fine-tune and slowly incorporate the bits of us that we want more of. We actually have a lot of say over this, a lot of power, even if we don't, even if we, much of shadow work is really giving up, ceding control. We still maintain agency and power, to incorporate the bits that feel most resonant and also most safe.
And I agree with you. A huge component is agency. Another thing I would add to that is assertiveness, because quite often in society today, when people are on the verge of doing that shadow work or wanting to integrate it, we label it as midlife crisis. That's just one example, and that's quite often frowned upon, right? Because if someone's making drastic changes in their lives, it's like, oh, he's going or she's going through midlife crisis, and then immediately you fall into another label and a box. The other piece I would offer is, if you are seeking advice, what worked for one person may not work for you. So just be mindful of that, because we're complex systems as individuals, and a lot of the times the issues we're struggling with are also complex in nature, and there's not a one size fits all type of solution. So I would perhaps look at other people for advice, but don't take it at face value. Explore what it is that you need. And there's often other people out there, and I hate to say it, but who perhaps don't even know what they're talking about. So just be aware of that as well. Do what feels right to you. And that's, I think, the main message I would like to end this with, from my perspective. But kind of over to you, Pierre. Any final thoughts?
I think that's a great way to end. I'd also be aware the one size fits all in general, and we're probably a little biased here. Neither of us takes the the sort of approach to have the answers for everybody. And I think that in fact speaks to that speaks to humility, but I think more importantly, it speaks to the complexity of what we're actually discussing here.
Mm-hmm.
That our neural networks, that our upbringings, our selves, human psychology, humankind. These are all of these discussions are really complex. It's unlikely that we have in these discussions a universal answer
Mm-hmm.
ever. It's rare.
Yeah.
And so I would say, as compelling as it might be to steer toward and take in messages that feel very directive and very by people who might feel exceedingly confident in what they're saying, it's often the maintenance of humility in these areas of discussion that allow for us to define for each of us what feels most resonant, what feels most valuable, and to put aside perhaps what doesn't, what's not going to help, or more importantly, what might guide us to a place where we feel unsafely vulnerable without someone there to help guide us directly. And so it is important then to make sure to take what you hear with a grain of salt, and to seek professional help if what you begin to dig into feels really weighty or feels really vulnerable. And I think again we're both biased in that we offer and seek professional help and have done so throughout our lives.
And I think kind of pulling some messaging from our last live around therapy as well is just be mindful, if you do seek professional help, it may not be the right person for you. So again, the one thing I just want to, I guess, emphasize is most often we know what feels right inside of us. So go with your intuition, because that's the most important thing. And if something doesn't feel right, whether it's advice or even professional help, just listen to yourself, because at the end of the day, you know internally what's going on. And some people may prescribe things that they know has worked for others, but it may not work for you. It might not be your answer. So keep exploring until you feel right internally. That's the only thing I could, kind of share from my own personal experiences. Keep doing it until it starts feeling right. And I guess the other last part would be, because I love this analogy that Aziz Ansari used in one of his specials, but he talked about how when we start having compassion for other people that we see struggling too, it helps us too. Then, we're able to minimize that frustration and anger towards them. And the analogy he used was, it's just their algorithm is different than ours.
I like that.
So when you start thinking that way, I think because we ourselves don't have all the answers. As much as some people may think they do, we don't. So yeah,
beautiful. Yeah, that's a great way to end.
All right. Well, thanks, Pierre. Thank you for doing this while you were away.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. So looking forward to the next one, and I'm sure we'll be chatting in between. So take care and enjoy your trip.
Thank you, sir. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye, everyone.